I threw away 6 years, a home, and a woman who remembered how I liked my coffee, for someone who forgot my last name when things got hard. The night I crossed the line, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Buffalo Wild Wings at 11:47 p.m., reading a text that said you up? And telling myself it didn't mean anything. That's the part I need you to understand first. I didn't trip and fall into this. I stood at the edge, looked down, and I jumped. I just told myself I was only leaning. Her name was Danielle. Not my girlfriend's name. My girlfriend's name was Sloane, and she was at home, probably asleep on her side of the bed with her phone face down and her reading glasses still on, the way she always fell asleep mid-chapter. I knew exactly where Sloane was. I knew exactly what she was doing. And I still typed back, "Yeah, what's up to Danielle," knowing full well what you up at 11:47 p.m. meant. I knew. I always knew. I just needed one more excuse to pretend I didn't. Sloane and I had been together for 6 years. 6 years. We met at a mutual friend's apartment during a Super Bowl party neither of us cared about. She was in the kitchen making tea while everyone else was screaming at the television, and I wandered in looking for a beer and ended up staying in that kitchen for 2 hours just talking to her. She had this way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week, and I was 26 years old and nobody had ever made me feel that interesting before. I drove home that night thinking about her. I texted our mutual friend the next morning asking for her number. I was nervous when I called her, and I hadn't been nervous about a girl since high school. By our second year together, she knew I took my coffee with 1 sugar and oat milk, not regular milk, because regular milk made it taste flat to me. She just knew. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just made it right, every morning, and handed it to me before I even asked. That sounds small. That sounds like nothing. But 6 years later, sitting alone in an apartment with nothing but a drip machine and a bag of grounds, I would have given almost anything to have someone hand me a cup of coffee made exactly the way I liked it, not because I asked, but because they'd been paying attention long enough to just know. I didn't appreciate it. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just detail. We bought a house in year 4. A little brick 2-story in a neighborhood with mature trees and a farmer's market 2 blocks away on Saturdays. Sloane cried when we got the keys. Not dramatic crying, just quiet tears while she held the key in her palm and looked at the front door, and I remember thinking she was being a little much. I remember thinking that. I stood there watching the woman I loved cry happy tears about the home we were building together, and some part of me felt vaguely impatient. I want to go back and shake myself by the collar. I want to ask myself what exactly I was in such a hurry to get to that was better than this. Because I have the answer now and the answer is nothing. There was nothing better. There was only worse. Work changed things, I told myself. That was excuse number 1. I had gotten a new job about 8 months before everything fell apart, a sales role at a tech company with a louder culture, longer hours, and coworkers who treated weeknight bar tabs like a personality. I started coming home later. Not every night. But often enough that Sloane noticed. She didn't nag. That's the thing about Sloane. She wasn't a nagger. She would just get quiet in this particular way, a kind of careful quiet, like she was measuring her words before she used them, and she'd ask if I was okay, and I'd say yeah, just tired, and she'd nod and go back to whatever she was doing, and I would feel, for just a second, a small flash of irritation that she didn't push harder. That's the poisonous logic of a man building a case against his own relationship. I was annoyed when she brought things up. I was annoyed when she didn't. I was rewriting the rules of the game in real time so that she could never win, because deep down I was already looking for a reason to feel like the relationship was lacking. I needed it to be lacking. Because I had already started noticing Danielle. Danielle worked on the sales floor with me. She was loud in the way that reads as confidence when you're not paying close enough attention. She laughed at everything I said. She texted me memes during meetings. She called me babe once as a joke and then looked at me sideways to see how I reacted, and instead of letting it land flat the way a man with any self-awareness should have, I laughed, and she filed that away, and so did I. That was the first foothold. A word said as a joke that neither of us treated as a joke. I told myself she was just a friend. I told myself this even as I started putting a little more thought into what I wore on days I knew I'd see her. I told myself this when I started mentioning her casually to Sloane, just enough to put the name into circulation so it wouldn't seem suspicious later, which is the most deliberate form of premeditation there is, and I called it nothing. I called it having a friend at work. My boys didn't help. I need to be honest about that too, because I let them off too easy in my own head for too long. Brian, who'd been divorced for 2 years and spent most of his free time on dating apps, started calling Sloane ball and chain sometime around month 3 of me working with Danielle. Not to her face. Just in the way that guys do, like it's a joke, like it's shorthand for something, but it plants a seed. It tells you that your relationship is a constraint instead of a choice. Brian had also cheated on his own wife, though he told the story in a way where somehow his wife had driven him to it, and I nodded along like that made sense because it was easier than asking him why he was still proud of it. Another guy from work, Trayvon, had a running bit about how once you bought a house with someone it was over, like settling down was a form of dying. He said this constantly. He thought it was funny. I thought it was a little funny too, which tells you everything about where my head was. I had a home I chose to buy with a woman I chose to love, and I was letting some 29-year-old divorced guy with a podcast no one listened to tell me it was a prison. The night it actually started with Danielle was not the parking lot night. That was just the first text. The actual start was 3 weeks earlier at a work happy hour where I had 4 drinks instead of 2, and she touched my arm when she laughed and held on a half second too long, and I did not move away. That's the real moment. Every moment after that was just momentum. I could map out every excuse I used. I was stressed. Sloane and I had been arguing more, mostly about me being distant, which I was, but I blamed the arguments on the distance instead of the other way around. I told myself Danielle made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a while, which is one of the most self-serving lies a man can tell himself, because what she actually made me feel was desired in a new way, and those are not the same thing, and I was 32 years old and I should have known the difference. I didn't want to know the difference. The text with Danielle became a separate phone folder. Then a second app. Then eventually a second SIM I told Sloane was for work. Sloane, who trusted me completely, who had never once gone through my phone without asking, who had never once accused me of something I wasn't doing, accepted that explanation with the full weight of 6 years of earned trust. And I used her trust against her like a tool. I need to sit with that sentence for a second. She trusted me because I had given her every reason to. Because for 5 years and some months, I had been a man worth trusting. And then I used the trust I'd spent 5 years building as a cover to do the thing that would destroy us. There is no version of this story where I am not the villain. I told myself Danielle and I had a connection. I convinced myself it was real, that it meant something, that I wasn't just a 32-year-old man with a good enough life making a stupid, ego-driven mistake. I told myself this was important. This was me figuring out what I actually wanted. This was growth, maybe. Personal revelation. These are the stories men tell themselves when they're doing the worst things they've ever done and they can't stand to see themselves clearly. What it actually was, Danielle was exciting because she was new. Full stop. She didn't know about my irritating habits, my financial anxiety, the way I shut down in arguments, the fact that I was deeply, quietly afraid of being ordinary. She only knew the version of me I performed for her. And I had spent so long performing for her that I had almost started to believe that version was the real one. Sloane knew the real one. That was the problem. She knew me, actually knew me, and I had started to find that uncomfortable. The night of the parking lot, I drove home 40 minutes later than I should have with a story about a phone call with a client that ran long. Sloane was already in bed. I stood in the bathroom for a long time looking at myself in the mirror, not because I felt guilty enough to stop, but because I was trying to find a version of my face that didn't look like what I was doing. I couldn't find it. I went to bed anyway. I slept. That part might be the worst part. That I slept. It went on for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of lies, calendar management, gas station breath mints, deleted messages, the constant low-level hum of being a man living 2 lives and telling himself he had a handle on it. Sloane, to her credit, and to her detriment, kept trying. She suggested we take a weekend trip. I made excuses. She bought us tickets to a show she knew I'd like. I went, but I was somewhere else the entire night and she knew it, and she looked at me in the car on the way home with this careful, searching look, like she was trying to find me inside myself, and I looked out the window. I hate that memory. I hate it more than almost any other. The way it ended was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no plates thrown, no dramatic confrontation in the rain. It ended the way most real betrayals end, quietly, and that quiet was somehow worse than anything loud could have been. Sloane had borrowed my laptop to print something, a work form, nothing significant. She wasn't looking for anything. She has told me this since, and I believe her, because Sloane was not the type to snoop, had never been the type, which is precisely why I had gotten lazy. There was an email thread open in my browser. Not even incriminating on its own, just a chain with Danielle's personal email that started professionally and very visibly did not stay that way. One scroll down and the picture was clear. I was in the kitchen when I heard her go quiet. Not a gasp, not a sound at all actually, just the sudden, total absence of the small ambient noises a person makes when they're just existing in a space. The printer stopped. I heard her set the laptop down. Then silence. She walked into the kitchen and she looked at me. Just looked at me. Her face was not angry. It was not destroyed. It was something I didn't have a word for at the time and have spent months since trying to find the right one. It was like recognition. Like she had been carrying a question she was afraid to ask for a long time and the answer had just arrived, and the answer was exactly as bad as she'd feared, and part of her, the part that had been bracing for this, almost wasn't surprised. And that almost not surprised look was the most devastating thing I had ever seen on a human face in my life. She said, "I need you to leave tonight." That was it. No screaming. No crying, at least not in front of me. Just 4 words delivered in a voice so calm it made my knees feel wrong. I said her name. I said I could explain. I said the word please at least 3 times in the span of 30 seconds, and every time I said it she just looked at me with that same expression, that horrible quiet recognition, and I understood, standing in the kitchen of the house we had picked out together, the house with the mature trees and the farmer's market 2 blocks away, that there was nothing I could say that was going to matter. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and I left. I sat in the car at the end of our street for 20 minutes. I looked at the front light she always left on when one of us was coming home late. It was on. She had left it on out of habit, probably without thinking, and that detail nearly broke me completely. I drove to a hotel. I stared at the ceiling until 4 a.m. I texted Danielle and told her what happened, and she said, "Oh no, I'm sorry, that's rough," and sent a sad face emoji. That was the night I started understanding, in small, terrible increments, exactly what I had done. I want to tell you about the specific kind of loneliness that comes from burning down your own life. It's not like being sad. Sadness is something that happens to you. This was something I had built, methodically and over months, with full knowledge and full intention, and I got to live inside it every single day, and I couldn't even be angry at anyone but myself. That's the part the movies leave out. When the disaster is entirely your fault, you don't even get the comfort of blame. Danielle stopped responding consistently about 9 days after Sloane asked me to leave. Not all at once, it was gradual, the way things decay rather than break. Texts that got slower. Responses that got shorter. I told myself she was just giving me space to figure things out. I told myself she was being considerate. I was 32 years old with a graduate degree and I had apparently learned nothing about what you up texts at midnight actually indicate about a person's long-term intentions. By week 3, she had posted a photo on Instagram at a bar with a guy I didn't recognize and her arm around his waist. I stared at that photo for a long time. Not with anger, exactly, but with this spreading, cold recognition that I had torched my entire life for a woman who had moved on in 21 days and hadn't bothered to tell me. When I finally texted her to ask what was going on, she said, and I will remember this exact wording until I die, she said, I never said we were anything official. I think you read into it. I threw away 6 years for a woman who looked at 11 weeks of lying to my partner as something I had read into. I had nowhere to process that, because I had nobody left to call. Brian had, predictably, told me it would all work out, that Sloane would come around, that women always came around, and when it became clear that wasn't happening, he stopped having much to say at all. He wasn't cruel about it. He just sort of quietly receded, the way people do when the outcome of your story stops being useful to their own. He'd built his whole divorced guy personality around the idea that relationships were traps and cheating was inevitable and everyone was basically doing it, and my story was supposed to end with me free and thriving, not sitting in a studio apartment eating cereal at 11 p.m. and staring at a wall. My other friends were mostly shared friends. And I want to be honest about this, they chose Sloane. Not all of them made it loud. Some of them just got slowly unavailable. Texts that never quite got answered. Group plans where the details stopped making it to me. One of our closest mutual friends, a woman named Claire who had been at almost every significant event in our relationship, texted me about 6 weeks after the split. The entire text said, "I love you but I can't be in the middle of this. She's not okay. I hope you figure out whatever it is you were looking for." And then she didn't respond to my reply. I still haven't heard from her. I wasn't going to tell you about my mother, but it matters. My mother found out through my aunt, who found out through a friend of Sloane's family. The conversation was not long. My mother did not yell. My mother, who is a quiet woman who chooses her words with great precision, said, "I don't understand who you decided to be. But I hope you find your way back from it." And then she changed the subject to my cousin's new baby and we never talked about it again. That was somehow worse than if she'd screamed at me. The house sold 4 months after the split. Sloane and I had to communicate through a mediator for most of it because every time we were in the same room, I couldn't hold myself together and she didn't want my falling apart to become her problem. That's the sentence that gutted me the most, when her lawyer mentioned it in a call, that Sloane found direct communication with me emotionally taxing. I had taken a woman who once stayed up with me until 2 a.m. because I was anxious about a work presentation, who had driven 40 minutes in ice to bring me soup when I had the flu, and I had become someone she found emotionally taxing to stand near. The day the house sold, I drove past it. I don't know why. I couldn't have told you what I was hoping to feel or find. The new family had a little kid's bike on the porch and some potted plants by the door that weren't ours. Someone else's ordinary life was already growing up through the cracks of what ours used to be. I drove home to my studio apartment and sat on the floor because I didn't feel like sitting on the couch, and I think I stayed on the floor for about 2 hours. I tried to write her a letter. More than once. I need to confess this because it matters to understanding how far gone I was. I wrote Sloane letters, 3 of them, across the span of about 2 months, and I never sent any of them because halfway through each one I'd realized that what I was actually doing was writing for myself, trying to build a record of my own guilt that made me feel like I was doing something, and that sending them would be making her manage my feelings about what I had done to her. She deserved better than to receive a letter from the man who destroyed her trust and be expected to respond to it in a way that was healing for him. So I kept the letters. They're in a folder on my laptop. I read them sometimes when I'm feeling like I need to remember exactly who I am now. Work became complicated around month 3. Danielle was still at the company. We passed each other in the hall. She was perfectly civil. Professionally appropriate. She smiled at me exactly the way you smile at someone you had a brief, inconsequential situation with that you've both agreed to move past. I watched her laugh at someone else's joke in the break room one afternoon and thought, she does not think about this at all. Not even a little. The entire structure of my life had crumbled, and to her it was a Tuesday. I asked for a transfer to a different office location. I got it. That was, genuinely, the first good decision I had made in close to a year. But moving offices didn't move the feeling. That's the thing they don't explain clearly enough. The feeling doesn't have a location. You can go to a new city and the ceiling in your new bedroom still looks like the ceiling you stared at the night you blew everything up. You can unpack new boxes in a new apartment and your hands still know the way they used to open the front door of the house you shared with someone who loved you. You can buy a new coffee maker and stand in a new kitchen and make your coffee and it tastes wrong, and it will always taste wrong because the thing that made it taste right wasn't the coffee, it was the person who made it without being asked. I thought about that constantly. The coffee thing. It sounds ridiculous. A fully grown man unraveling because of coffee. But it was never about the coffee, and I think you already know that. It was about being known. Being someone that another person had paid enough attention to that they just knew, automatically and without fanfare, the small specific facts of your preferences. Sloane knew my coffee order. She knew I hated driving on highways at night. She knew that when I got very quiet I wasn't being cold, I was anxious and needed someone to ask me a gentle question. She knew the name of the teacher who'd embarrassed me in front of my 6th grade class and why I still sometimes flinched when people laughed unexpectedly. She had 6 years of information about me and she carried all of it with care, and I had taken all of that knowledge and care and I had handed it back to her broken. Danielle, for contrast, once asked me after 8 weeks of talking almost every day what I did for work again. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. There were nights in that first year after everything where I genuinely did not know who I was. That sounds like an exaggeration and I wish it were. I had built so much of my sense of self inside the relationship, inside the house, inside the life we were constructing, that when I burned it down I found there wasn't much underneath. I had a job and a gym membership and a small collection of streaming subscriptions and absolutely nothing else. No identity outside of the life I had thrown away. I'd let friendships go thin because I was in a serious relationship. I'd stopped pursuing hobbies because we were always busy with house stuff. I had not cultivated a self outside of that relationship, and when the relationship was gone I stood in the rubble and discovered I had no coordinates for myself at all. I started seeing a therapist around month 4. Not because I had a breakthrough moment or decided to better myself. I started going because I woke up one Thursday morning and could not find a reason to get out of bed and stayed there until 2 p.m. and that scared me enough to make a phone call. The therapist, a quiet man named Dr. Webb who seemed constitutionally incapable of being shocked by anything, let me talk for the first 3 sessions without saying much. I explained everything. I explained Danielle and the texts and the excuses and the way I'd convinced myself the relationship was already dead so I might as well. He let me finish. Then he said, very calmly, "What do you think you were really afraid of?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't have an answer for months. When I finally got to one, it was uglier than I expected. I was afraid that Sloane seeing me completely, all of me, the anxious and ordinary and not particularly remarkable parts of me, would eventually lead to her leaving. I was afraid of being known that fully and still being found lacking. So I manufactured the rejection first. I took the story into my own hands and made sure that the ending was my fault instead of my inadequacy. I would rather be the person who threw something away than the person it was thrown away from. I told Dr. Webb this and he nodded and wrote something down, and I sat there feeling simultaneously seen and deeply ashamed, and also aware that this psychological explanation, as true as it might have been, did not make anything I had done acceptable. Understanding why you do a thing doesn't undo the thing. Sloane moved on. Not immediately, and not in a way that was designed to hurt me, she's not that kind of person. But about 14 months after everything, a mutual acquaintance mentioned, not maliciously, just in the way people let things slip, that Sloane was seeing someone. A man who worked in urban planning, apparently. She'd met him through a volunteer thing she'd gotten involved with. The acquaintance said she seemed happy, and said it in that specific way that meant compared to when she was with you. I want to tell you I handled that information with grace. I did not. I handled it in my car with both hands on the wheel going nowhere, just sitting in a parking lot again, because that seems to be what parking lots are for me now. And I thought about her laughing with someone new, someone who hadn't broken anything yet, and I felt something I didn't know how to categorize. Not jealousy, exactly. More like grief, but the specific grief of knowing that you are the reason for your own absence from something good. She was happy. She was making her life bigger. And I was the thing that had temporarily made it smaller. She deserved someone who would appreciate every single ordinary, extraordinary thing about her. I had been that person once, or I thought I had the potential to be, and I wasted it. Either way, she had gone and found someone who could actually show up for her, and the only person responsible for me not being that person was me. I rebuilt. Slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of false starts. I am not going to dress up the rebuilding as redemption because this story is not about redemption. I got better at showing up to my own life. I learned, slowly, who I was without a relationship to reflect myself in. I got rid of some friends who thought my behavior was basically fine. I stopped performing and started trying to just be honest, even when honesty was unflattering, which for me it often was. But here's what doesn't rebuild: the specific shape of what you broke. You can become a better man. I think I did, or I'm trying to. But becoming a better man doesn't restore what the worst version of you destroyed. Sloane doesn't know the better version of me. She knows the version that looked at 6 years of love and care and decided it wasn't exciting enough. That's the version she'll remember, and she should, because that version is the one that was real when it counted. I keep coming back to this one image. Our kitchen on a Saturday morning. Sloane in a t-shirt she'd had since college, hair up, making 2 cups of coffee without asking or thinking, just doing it because she knew. Handing me the right one. Turning back to whatever she was reading. Me standing there, cup in hand, already somewhere else in my head, already building the case, already looking toward the door. I was so certain there was something better beyond that door. There wasn't. There was Danielle, who forgot my last name when things got hard, and there was a parking lot, and there were months of ceiling staring, and there was Dr. Webb asking me what I was afraid of, and there was the slow, grinding work of figuring out who I was after I'd scraped away every good thing I'd been given. I'll tell you this, and I mean it as plainly as I can, if you are reading this while holding something real, while living inside something quiet and ordinary and good, while someone who loves you is in the next room making coffee or watching TV or asleep with their glasses still on, do not do what I did. Do not build a case against your own happiness. Do not let some idiot at a bar tell you that stability is a cage. Do not mistake being known for being trapped, and do not mistake the thrill of being unknown for something that will last. I know exactly how I like my coffee. I have known for years. I make it myself every morning, and I make it right, and I drink it alone. That's not a metaphor. That's just my life now. And I built it with my own 2 hands.